let's get into a word, proprioception. Does anyone know what proprioception means? Go for it.
It's your knowledge of where you are in space.
Exactly. So best example, everyone close your eyes. Try and touch one pointer finger to the other pointer finger. Can you do it? With your eyes closed? Yes.
Only after a couple of tries.
So proprioception needs to be improved. So if you can close your eyes and you touch them really quick, that's how you know where your finger is in its space without looking at it. So that's proprioception, and it's often not thought about, but it's really important. You need to know where your ankles are in space when you're running. You need to know where your knees at, where your hips at. But your brain does all that without you actually focusing on it, because that's a lot of thought process through the whole thing. So proprioception is important, and it's one of the things we're going to be focusing on with some of the strength training. A lot of it's going to be single leg work, anything single leg balance, RDLs, single leg deadlifts. A lot of it's anything that puts you on one leg. You're going to need that proprioceptive awareness. A lot of times you lose that because of either a restricted joint that's not moving properly, or you have lack of flexibility in, say, the hamstrings, which is a common one for most. That leads us into flexibility, mobility, and stability. Is flexibility the same as mobility? Yes or no? No. Good. Flexibility is passive. Flexibility is that ability to, I'm going to stretch my hamstrings, I'm going to bend down, and I'm just going to let gravity take me there. I'm not doing anything, really. I'm just bending over. It's all in the back that's causing my movement. The hamstrings aren't doing anything. So mobility is active. So you're actively controlling those ranges with your muscles. The hip hinge is probably the most basic movement that every workout will ever use, the hip hinge. It might be singular or it might be with both of them, but the idea behind the hip hinge is you're able to move your body without using other parts. So say, it's super easy to think about it in the shoulder. I can move my shoulder without moving my upper torso. I can move this part. I don't do this to move my shoulder. But people want to do that with their low back and their hip. But you should be able to do, they're two different joints. So why can't I move that joint? Because it's a ball and socket joint. It should move. Yeah. So the hip is a ball and socket, whereas the low back is a series of vertebrae. The shoulders, yeah, they're both ball and socket joints. They're just, the hip has a larger surface area, and it's meant to hold force. That's the only difference between the hip and the shoulder. And that's where the idea of proprioception. It's an awkward position, so you feel like you're doing it right, but that's because your brain is associated with that, with being the right position that I need to be in. But until somebody sees it from the outside and goes, hey, you're not hinging properly, then you don't know how to fix it. So that's why having coaches around, or having at least like a partner there with your workouts, especially when you're starting off, and helping each other point out hey, you're running that low back a little bit, try and activate the core a little bit more, or work through, because a lot of, especially with us, none of us were perfect at any of the movements when we first started them. You have people that have the mobility and it's easier, but once you start going in there, you can't get those positions until you repetitively do it. It's just like running. It's hard. Has anyone tried to change their form while running? It's one of the hardest things to do, because you feel like you need to be moving this way, but you're like, oh, this feels awkward. Why would I run like this? But that's how you should be running. So same thing with weightlifting as well. We're not, the goal with weightlifting and running isn't to pack on a bunch of pounds and lift the most weight as possible. The goal with it is to increase your strength, to reduce the injuries, so that you can see or experience the load how it should, rather than all the tissues taking all the forces and not distributing it properly. So after mobility, once you get the mobility, you have to learn how to use it through stability. And the problem with that is a lot of runners want to do the flexibility, they get mobile, and that's where they stop. Look at most warm-ups. They all start stretching, foam rolling, jabbing lacrosse balls in places that are uncomfortable, and then they start running. So you have all this new motion, but you haven't learned how to use it yet. So adding that stability factor activates the muscles and strengthens that new zone of motion. So, Billy, you want to give an example of a stability type exercise?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few, but I mean, just even a basic one where if I'm just standing, okay, making sure that my knees in line with hips in line with knee, knees in line with foot, and I'm just focusing on balancing here, okay, and now I can put more of a hip stability into this while I'm reaching out as far as I can, you know, to the right, you know, back up, to the middle, and then to that opposite side, you know. I can do one where I'm in a split stance position here.
This is a really good one for runners because you get into those extreme positions.
You know, and some of these things when we do programs and stuff, I always take some of the college kids that come back. We work with a lot of hockey players in town. They typically come in, we start from the ground up. Okay, we don't start from the stand, we start from the very basics and then work back up again. So every summer they come back, they start from this position, learning how to, in this tall kneeling position, that I'm driving my toes into the ground. That's going to activate my glutes, which is going to stabilize my hips, which is going to turn on my core, which is going to allow me to do these different movements very stable, very controlled. Then I put myself into a half kneeling position, okay? Looking for my back knees in line with my hips. My front knee is in line with my heel, okay? And same thing with my toe. I'm driving my toe in, looking for that glute activation, okay? Hip stability, okay? Then I can start to pick myself up from there, okay? And now I'm in this position, okay? Now I'm doing things from here, okay? On top of that, once I get good at that, now I'm here. So there's a lot of stability moves between that ground position.
So the way you would progress that is you stretch. Then I'm a big fan of light stretching. Overstretching has been shown to reduce actual performance. So a lot of the times they promote actual stretching towards the end, and dynamic, you can do dynamic stretching towards the beginning. So dynamic stretch, get that mobility with those hip 90-90s, and then you can add a lunge type stability work to activate those hip muscles and get those glutes firing before you run. It takes a little bit longer to get running, but you're going to notice once you start doing it that the run feels easier and it's more comfortable, rather than that first mile is uncomfortable and you're working through, your hips are tight, and it just is terrible. And then you get into a flow and then you're like, oh, this feels so much easier. It's because your hip is open and the glutes are firing now. So why not start that from the beginning? So that's kind of the purpose of that. So stability is probably the most overlooked portion of training, and it doesn't have to be a lot of weight is another thing. So let's say you are adding some stability work, some single leg work, single leg stands, some balances. A lot of the times, say the best one, stability work with the core, doing a plank. Planks are really good for core stability and postural work, but at that elite level, if you're really struggling to cut off time from some of your races, then the next step is to make those more sport specific. So doing a plank but with a leg moving up and down, or doing reaches into a plank. So now you're adding that functional movement similar to a run. So if I'm in like this position, I'm in like a bear plank, then I can move that hip up and down. So now you're adding a movement that is stabilizing you, but it's similar to running. So that's how you get more sports specific, which is going to get you that best performance. Now, if you can't plank for 10 seconds, then yeah, obviously focus on that plank. It's going to make you more stable, but you have to progress it at some point. to more specific. All right. So this another approach that I'm sure you guys look at, but you may not know it by the actual term that I know it as, because in the person who created it is a PT and a strength coach, but it's called the joint by joint approach to strength training, or just rehab in general. The body is built in a series of mobility and stability joints. So if you think about it, you start in the foot. You want the foot to be stable. So as you're running, you want that foot to be in that arch position. You want that medial arch to be there. You don't want flat-footed. So you want that stable, but you want a mobile ankle. So you want the ankle to be super mobile, in control. Obviously, you don't. There's realms that you don't want to get into. An over mobile ankle is bad, but you want it mobile. Then you go up to the knee. You want that knee to be stable. Shift up to the hips. You want that to be mobile. Low back, stable. Mid back, mobile. And in rehab, you're going to start finding positions that you work those, or rehab or strength training, you're going to find those positions that are comfortable and say, why would I want to work on my knee mobility? I know it sounds weird, but the only people that need to work on knee mobility is anyone that had an ACL surgery. Those are the only people really that need to work knee mobility. Everything else is, I'm in this position, I want this knee over my toes, and I don't want this to be out here, because that's an over mobile joint. You want that stable. But with the ankle, you want that to be mobile so you can work stretches. So the way we use these alternating joints and of stability and mobility is how you program and how you mobilize. So warm-ups, consistently mobilizing the hips, mobilizing the ankles, preparing those for movements. You want to mobilize the mid-back, which is a commonly missed spot for mobility, because if anyone's seen anyone like this, that old like hump that people get when they get older, try and have them raise their hand over their head. They can't, because it gets stuck like right here. So if you open up that spine, you can raise that arm up overhead, because the shoulder and the mid-back are so linked with the mobility that they have.
A good one for that too. Get back. So working on shoulder mobility, scapular stability. Okay. He's got his arms up by his head, bent at 90, and he's going to try to keep 2 points of contact. Okay, his elbows and his wrists, and he's going to slide those arms up as high as he can without raising those hands up the ground, and then right back down. Coming down, exhaling. Knees are slightly bent. So this is a great one. This is a great one if you're starting off with. You can do it on the floor or even against the wall. Okay, you can back yourself up against the wall. Just try to maintain those 2 points of contact. Once you start to lose those, then right back down. Okay, but that's a good one for shoulder mobility, scapular stability.
Yeah.
They're called scap floor slides. Once again, they can be done on the ground or against a wall.
Big thing too when I'm doing these is when I'm breathing, I'm not just breathing into my chest, right? I'm breathing through my diaphragm into my stomach. We call that diaphragmatic breathing. A lot of runners, actually, funny enough, my mom's training to do a half marathon. She was saying, I'm having a lot of trouble controlling my breathing when I run because your diaphragm's weak, and it's something that also gets overlooked. So really, when you're doing any type of weightlifting exercise, focus on filling your stomach with air versus your chest, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm going to go and I'm going to do even just a basic back squat, right? And I go and I breathe in at the top, and I breathe in my chest, my lower back tends to hyperextend, right? Whereas if I breathe into my stomach, what that does is it immediately tucks my pelvis underneath me, and then when I crunch my diaphragm on top of that, I now have full control of keeping a neutral spine, right? So when I go down, my spine stays nice and straight, versus breathing into my chest, and then I go down, I hyperextend. That's where we get a lot of lower back issues, which can also result into SI issues, which is a whole nother realm.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on top of that, the way I explain it to patients is don't crush the can. So if you think about it, you have an empty soda can. It has no dents, nothing. You step on it, it's actually pretty durable. It's hard to actually crush that can. As soon as you put a little divot, little dent into the side of the can and try to crush it, it bends to that side almost instantly. So the core is the same way. The core itself is, there's no bones actually really holding it together. Like the mid back has the rib cage to keep it stable. The core doesn't, or the low back doesn't have anything. So what it utilizes is muscles and pressures. So you have the top part of the core, which is the diaphragm, and then you have the pelvic floor muscles that are doing this motion when they contract. So in the middle, since it's a controlled space, if you compress the top, compress the bottom, it presses out. So you have a 360-degree pressure system basically there. So if you're, like you're saying, if you're flaring the ribs, that's a dent. So as soon as you try and do something, you're going to scissor, which is called an open scissor position. For runners, you'll see that when they they do this. So that's an open scissor, which is going to increase risk for low back pain. Whereas as soon as you stabilize that core in a 360 degree pressure system, now you have no hinge anymore, and that transfer from forces on the ground can actually go into the ground again. So you're increasing your force production with each step rather than all that force from the ground going into the low back. So that's the little things that you need to be aware of. So this kind of pushes into the injury prevention portion. Keep it fairly brief because I can talk about certain injuries for an hour just alone. I could talk about plantar fasciitis for an hour, to be honest. It's going to be boring, but I'll dig into it if anyone wants to go into that. But can anyone name the #1 cause of injury? Any guesses? Good guess. Prior injury. Prior injury is the #1 cause of injury. Yeah. So if you have, say, I have torn my ACL 10 years ago, I am at a higher risk of injury at that left knee because of a previous injury. The body doesn't make things perfect once they fix it. So scar tissue isn't as innervated, so there's not as much nerve connection. So that brain to joint connection's not there as well. The muscles around them don't work the same because if you've gotten an ACL, so the ACL is just a good one. They'll use, say, somebody else, they'll use a cadaver hamstring, they'll use hamstring, they'll use bone from a different muscle or a muscle from the leg, but it's not the tissue that's supposed to be there. So the body can sometimes think that's a foreign material. Any form of knee inflammation. So if I tweak my knee a little bit, I run in, I twist my ankle, any of that inflammation that comes up can turn off muscles. So the body naturally turns off muscles with inflammation. So it's the idea of instability. So they've showed that with even just the slightest inflammation, the quad can get turned off by 50% just by just a hint of inflammation. So that's where you lead to instability. So say I have some inflammation, I go run, and then it makes it a little bit worse. The next day I don't take a rest day and I run again. Now you're at an even more of an increased risk because there's more inflammation in that joint. So if the quad's not working while you're running, what muscles are going to take advantage for that? Nothing really. So the knee joint itself is going to take that, and that's where you get those meniscal injuries, those ACL injuries. So all you had to do was get that inflammation to calm down a little bit, take a rest, and it's like no one wants to take that rest, but in the long run it's better for performance. Recovery is very important. So #2 injury, overuse is the #2 cause of injury. Overuse leads to fatigue, and most people think traumas happen from macro trauma, so like a car accident would be a macro trauma, or getting hit by something would be, or stepping off a curb and rolling the ankle, that's considered a macro trauma. But most running injuries are just repetitive use over and over, wear and tear. So that's going to happen at some point. You're going to find a mileage. You're going to get some pain. It's going to be uncomfortable. But the idea here is you're controlling fatigue. And you control that by strengthening those muscles and adding a strength portion to your workouts. So a stronger, thicker muscle is going to be able to withstand forces longer, and you're going to be able to produce forces at that same rate. So you're going to be able to keep your cadence longer with a stronger muscle. Strength training provides a stimulus to the muscle that you're not going to get through running. So strengthening the muscle as a whole, making it thicker, makes it be able to withstand more forces. And that's kind of the point. One of the best studies I've looked at compared 26,000 athletes and injuries with within those 26 athletes, they compared stretching, plyometrics, and strength training within this, I think it was a year. Out of those 26,000, 3,000 roughly got hurt. They showed that in their controlled groups with these studies, the strength training reduced sport injuries by 33%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is actually a very substantial amount, especially because running, you're going to get hurt. At some point, you might pull a muscle, you never know. But cutting something down by 33% is huge, and it also cut down overuse injuries in half. So just by strength training, adding a day that you're strengthening the muscles, working on stability, controlling those segments, cut down overuse injuries by half, and also reduced acute and chronic injuries. Funny enough, stretching had no effect on any of it. So stretching did nothing. Plyometrics were right after strength training. Had an improvement, but weren't as good as strength training. Yeah. I'm not going to talk about injuries per se. I think a lot of us are aware of the common injuries, hamstring strains. Knee pain often is caused by quad dominance, and most people, women are a little bit more at risk with quad dominance. It's just the facts. I can't tell you exactly why, and I don't think they know, researchers know why women are more quad dominant than men. Quad dominance changes the way the patella or the kneecap tracks, and it causes increased stress on the joints. So basically, any muscular imbalances are something that you can fix with strength training. And that's what a lot of what our goal is going to be to teach you on Friday is how to be symmetrical with most movements. So this comes down to performance. Everyone has their own goals when it comes to performance and their running. But everyone can kind of agree on the same thing. Our goal is to make you more economical, be able to run further with the same amount of energy. We want to be addressing all of your asymmetries. So if you can stand on your right leg for a minute, but you can only stand on your left leg for 30 seconds without falling over, that's an asymmetry that we want to fix because half of your running is done with one leg. So if one leg is weak, then most of your injuries are going to come on that one leg. Next and final, we want you to be as stress-free as possible. So we want it to be as easy as possible. So that's kind of the three goals: economical, fixing asymmetries, and being stress-free as possible. And I kind of sneak in there, the goal is force production because stronger muscles increases your force, your ability to increase your stride length by just being stronger. So economical, it's pretty easy. Increases in force increases the distance you can cover. So stronger hips can increase the distance you're covering. Super easy. Tendons are associated with 50% of your actual work. So when you take a step or when you're running, 50% of the tendons in your lower leg are reutilizing the forces from the ground and pushing it back in. That's why running's sometimes you find that walking is getting hard, so you kind of do that jog because it's easier because you're using the tendons in an increased force. If you want to find out what utilizing tendon without utilizing tendons feels like, it's called sprinting. Sprinting does utilize the elasticity of the tendons, so that's why you get tired so much faster. That's a larger use. So bigger muscles equals better efficiency. There's obviously in a point that large muscles, like if you've ever seen a bodybuilder run, it's real awkward. But that also comes down to muscle coordination. They're using single plane motions, bodybuilders traditionally will, to just get a larger muscle. They don't coordinate those muscles together. So as the training, what we're going to be doing on Friday is always going to be a dynamic movement where you're not usually utilizing just one muscle. You're going to have the core in there. You're going to be focusing on certain things like the glutes or the hamstrings, but it's never going to just be, I'm doing leg extensions so my quad gets stronger. All that's doing is building an asymmetry and not correlating to what your movement is. There's a science behind rep ranges and schemes. That's why programming is actually really hard once you get into it. Power production happens actually. So if you're looking to increase your speed, then you're going to be focusing on that power range, which is in the 1 to 2 ranges, 1 to 2 rep ranges. But if you're looking at trying to get muscles to last a little bit longer, then you're going to be doing those endurance ranges. And the difference is how you rest and how much force you're using. So that's kind of the stuff we'll be talking about. The bodybuilder stuff is in those. The goal is to make the largest muscle so muscles swell. So it's called hypertrophy.
We call it popcorn muscle.
Yeah.
It's big, but it's not really.
It's not strong.
Yeah.
It's not strong at all. It looks good, but that's why you see those big guys in the gym lifting like 30 pounds. And you're like, really? I figured you'd lift a little bit more than that. You like kind of judge them a little bit. Like I feel like you could lift more than that, but they can't because they're just trying to get their muscles to look good. So, function versus utilization. Symmetry, same thing. If you can't walk symmetrically, you can't run symmetrically. It just makes sense. I can't stand on one leg the same way like that previous example. If I can't stand on one leg the same as the other leg, I mean, obviously you have a dominant leg. If it's 1 minute on my right leg and 55 seconds on my left, like I could probably try and push a little bit more stability on my left leg, but honestly, that's about as good as I'm okay with that. But those large discrepancies are what I'm going to focus on, and we build out those asymmetries by doing a lot of those single leg works. Yeah.
When you have an asymmetry, then as you're structuring your strength training program, are you then really doubling down on that weaker side
What I traditionally do with asymmetries is I start on that leg, and I count my rep range based on what I can do on that leg, and then finish it off with my other leg. So I'll match that rep range on that leg. So single leg deadlift. So if I can only do this 5 times on this left leg, then that's what I'm going to do on that leg, and then I'm just going to match it with this leg so I don't build another asymmetry. So that's a little trick that I like to use with it. But what do you? Yeah. So when I do anything strength training, I always start with the weaker muscle. That's kind of my thought on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Another part of asymmetry is everyone thinks side to side, but you want to think top and bottom too. If I have stable legs, stable hips, everything, but I have no stability up top, then if I'm running, I'm looking good down here, but I start leaning because I have no stability in my core. This leg has to work a lot harder to move up and down. So you start overstriding or over activating the quads, and you don't turn on the glutes because you're doing this motion to get that hip up over off the ground, but you don't have enough time to get that hip all the way back. So you're almost cutting your normal stride and pushing it forward, which causes overstriding. So increased force. And then stress-free. There's 2 parts of stress-free. You got load rate, which we're not going to talk about. That's cadence. You're trying to take a lot of times you want to increase your cadence if you look like you're overstriding. It sounds like it's more work, but and in the long run, it's actually better on the body. So that's a lot of coaches, running coaches, will talk about cadence. It's not what we're talking about here today. And then the other one is working on instability. So it's kind of the same thing as symmetry. So you'll work, a lot of these things work hand in hand. So basically that's about what we're focusing on. Force production is a big one after all of that. It's the same concept. Large muscles produce large forces, and that's what we're focusing in. What?
A question about vertical stability. How do you tell, like, you know, like it seems a little bit easier to tell some things when you have a weakness in one leg over the other, but is it just by your posture?
It's usually postural. Another one is that scissor position that I told you, and when they're running, and you have this motion, that's how you know there's an instability somewhere, usually in the core. A lot of the upper body is going to be core stability or lack of motion in the thoracic spine or the mid-back. Because when you run, you got to have that ability to move the shoulders, or at least a little bit, because that rotation of the upper portion of the body is a counter force to the legs. So if you didn't have that upper body counter rotation, that's why the left leg follows that right leg, these forces are canceling themselves. So what you'd be doing if you didn't use that upper body would be doing this weird rotation motion, and you'd be putting way too much stress on the low back. So a lot of what we're looking at is it doesn't have to be straight up when you run, but you're not tilted like this or having an arch through your back while you run. So a lot of it's just noticing postures, and that's all the upper body really does in running. A lot of people will say that the arm swing helps with leg swing, which helps a little bit, but your body will naturally try and swing those arms through. So you can work on some of that, but getting a super strong upper body is more important for sprinters than it is distance. So one fact that we can get out of this is, so to build upon the stronger muscle increases force, because that's kind of what I want people to understand. It doesn't mean large muscles. So if you could gain 1 to 2 centimeters per stride, so if you think about it, that's very minuscule in your stride. You wouldn't even notice that you're getting that distance. So just by increasing glute strength, you can get that 1 to 2 centimeters into your stride length. If you add that into a marathon, which is about, it's hard to say, everyone has a different stride length, but they say it's roughly about 33,000 steps. So if you add 1 to 2 centimeters to that, you're getting, if you go through all the math that I did, you get to about 0.2 to 0.4% of a mile shaved off. So you're cutting the amount of steps that you have to do, so that in turn, if you average a 10-minute mile in your marathon, so just to make the math easier, you're cutting 2 to 4 minutes off your marathon time just by working your glutes a little bit stronger. You're doing the same amount of energy, same amount of everything, your form looks exactly the same, but now you're a little bit stronger in that push off. So it puts it into real numbers in that sense. But I think that's about all I have for today. There's a lot of random things I could talk about. If anyone has any questions for me.
What do you see as the role of chiropractic work in programming?
I think traditional chiropractors, you're going to be focusing more on joint mobility, making sure things are symmetrical. Joint loading is the same, but I often will add mobility or all three into it. So I'll add, now that I always go to the hips with runners, because the hips are where most of the force is absorbed through the whole lower body. All that force has to come up to here, and that's kind of why you see the body turn in like that, because it's supporting into a larger pelvis area. So if I loosen up the hips and then just go, okay, you're good, then now you have to work on your stability a little bit on your own. So as a more progressive chiropractor, a lot of them are doing it now. They will add some exercises towards the end or give you some home exercise. Hey, go do this. Versus, oh, now you're loose. Have a good day. See you after your run, kind of thing. So that's where the chiropractic line kind of fits. You're getting joint mobility, some muscle work, either a massage in there as well, or you're doing all of that on top of some strength training.